Good evening and welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society's Film Club. I'm Gavin Cleespy, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships. Just in case anyone is joining us, joining our film club for the first time, it's worth mentioning that the idea of this is very similar to a book club. We pick a different movie every month, people watch it on their own, and then we get together and have a discussion. This evening, we'll be discussing the 2005 film, Good Night and Good Luck. We are joined by Larry Tye to help us explore this film. Mr. Tye is a New York Times bestselling author. We have hosted him numerous times at MHS, most recently to discuss his book, Demagogue, The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joe McCarthy, which we hosted in July of 2020. This makes him a great person to discuss this movie with a great perspective on the historical accuracy of the film. His film was based on his first ever review of McCarthy's personal and professional papers, medical and military records, and the recently unsealed transcript of his closed-door congressional hearings. Larry Tye is also the author of 7 previous books, and from 1986 to 2001 was an award-winning reporter at the Boston Globe. As I'm sure many of you know, the Mass Historical Society hosts a variety of public programs, seminars, and teacher workshops throughout the course of the year. We offer many of these programs for free or for very modest costs, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. If you enjoy being a part of our film club, we hope you'll also consider being a member of the MHS to support our work. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Larry Tye, who is going to tell us a little bit about the historical accuracy of the movie.
Great. So if I were talking about the historical accuracy of the movie, this would be a very quick book talk. I think that what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about Joe McCarthy. I assume everybody here knows about him. I'd like to tell you some of the things that I found out about him when I was writing the book before we talk about the movie. And I actually want to start with a bit of process and tell you, when you are writing the 101st biography of somebody, what you hope and what your publisher hopes is that you get access to some new materials. And I want to tell you about some materials I looked at and about how, as an author, you go about trying to get them. And to me, the golden grail of new materials on Joe McCarthy were all of his personal and professional papers. This was a guy who served 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, and he had endless papers that nobody had ever seen. And when he died, his wife started organizing all of his papers, and she left them a year or 2 after he died. She left them to his alma mater, which was Marquette University in Milwaukee. And she left them with a provision that those papers would become public if either of 2 things happened. If their then infant daughter were to say the papers should become public, and for 60 years, Tierney McCarthy, their daughter, said either no or said nothing to every biographer who came along asking. The other provision was, when Tierney died, the papers would become public, and she was younger and healthier than me, so I thought that wasn't about to happen. So I tried everything. I wrote her what I thought were compelling letters. I used all the things that journalists and authors have to figure out somebody's most private email information or phone numbers, and I sent her emails and I called. I went with a friend who is a lot better looking than me, and I figured this was a guy who could charm her more than I could, and we knocked on her door. And she didn't answer the door, but a strange thing happened. The next door neighbor came out and asked what we were doing there, and it was clear from the phone in her hand that the next door neighbor was on the phone to Tierney, who was in the house refusing to answer the door. And the next door neighbor, we had a great conversation, and I brought the books that I had intended to sign to the daughter and gave them to the neighbor, hoping the neighbor would be charmed and would convince the daughter. None of that worked. I went to Tierney McCarthy's, the closest friend that she had in the real world. She was a little bit of a hermit, and her closest friend was a journalist named Greta Van Susteren. And Greta Van Susteren, who was CNN and Fox, and I think she's worked for every network, her father was Joe McCarthy's best friend. And she knew Tierney really well. And she and I knew her from years ago when I was at the Globe. And she agreed to be my advocate, and she advocated, and it did absolutely nothing. So exactly a week after I told my wife and my publisher that all bets were off and we were never going to see these papers, I decided to do one last thing, which was I sent a 6-pack of Grater's ice cream. Now, I don't know if anybody there is the ice cream fanatic that I am, but this is the best ice cream probably in the world, but I can definitely say in America. And they will mail it anywhere in America that you want and are willing to pay for. And they mailed her a 6-pack of ice cream, and it had a very short note in it. It said, "I want to leave a sweet taste in your mouth after all the sour experience you've had with me, and I promise never, ever to bother you again." And exactly 1 week after that ice cream arrived, I got a call from the chief archivist at Marquette saying, "I don't know what you did, but Tierney just got in touch with us, and she said what every author dreams of. Not just that she would open these papers, which had been under lock and key for 60 years, but she would open them just to me. And the day I got done looking at them, they'd go back under lock and key." Meaning not only were they there for me to use, but I didn't have to rush through it because I was the only one who could use it. So that was one set of papers that I got that nobody had ever looked at. And after you tell your publisher that you're not going to get something, if you can go back to them and counterintuitively say, "By the way, I got them," my publisher sent me a note saying, "My only reaction is the word Mullitzer, and I don't want to say the actual word he said, but it rhymes with Mullitzer." And this was the head of the Houghton Mifflin, and he was very excited. So the other set of papers I really wanted to see, I didn't believe that Joe McCarthy had died of what the world was told that Joe McCarthy died of, which was acute hepatitis. But I couldn't prove it. I thought that he was an alcoholic and he died of alcoholism. But that was my speculation. The family had said he died of acute hepatitis, and every newspaper in the world, when they ran the obituary on Joe McCarthy, said he died of hepatitis. So I asked, there's an organization that controls all the federal records called the National Archive and Records Administration, NARA. And NARA's director, its longtime director, who's just stepped down, was a guy from Beverly, Massachusetts, who had hosted me on my Bobby Kennedy book and was a big Massachusetts guy. And I went to him and said, "Can we get McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda Naval Hospital and from everywhere that we can get them?" And he said, "Look, after 50 years, it's at the discretion of the government," and he would put it through channels. And anytime a federal official tells you he's going to put something through channels, you give up on it. But I sent, again, a dozen letters to NARA, to the Navy, to the Marine Corps, to just about everybody. And again, just when I had given up, one day from our home in the little village of Cotuit on Cape Cod, my wife and I were going on a very early morning walk with a dog. And we saw at the head of our driveway an enormous brown box. And she said, "We better check out what that is." And I said, "The box will still be there when we get back from our walk. Let's go." And when we came back and opened the box, it turned out that it was thousands of pages of Joe McCarthy's medical records from Bethesda and from everywhere else. And it showed in excruciating detail every toe stub that he had ever had treated in all of his years as a senator. And what it showed beyond a doubt was that he died of alcoholism and not of hepatitis. I had sat down with 3 people to review the medical records, with the just retired dean of the Harvard Medical School, with the editor-in-chief emeritus of the New England Journal of Medicine, and with a very smart doctor from the University of Pennsylvania who specialized in hepatitis. And they all agreed that we could finally definitively say what Joe McCarthy had died of. But we could say something else based on those medical records. We could say how paranoid America was back then. And if this rings any bells in terms of what we're experiencing now, then you can ring the bells. How paranoid the military was that nobody would believe when they said what had happened to Joe McCarthy at the end of his life. They worried there would be conspiracy theories, that somebody had killed him, that it was maybe the Russians. And there were precisely those conspiracy theories. So what they did was the Navy stationed a medical orderly by Joe McCarthy's bedside for the last several days of his life, taking notes on everything he said, on who came and went from his room. There will never in the history of the world be as complete a recording of the last 3 or 4 days of somebody's life than there was of Joe McCarthy's. And so I had in writing every rant, every DT, and every hallucination that Joe McCarthy had as long as he articulated it those last days. And he had endless hallucinations those last days. So bottom line is we had all of his personal and professional papers. We had all of his medical records, and we had one other trove which no previous biographer had. And it just so happened that these were made public just around when I was writing the book. And they were the never disclosed transcriptions of all of Joe McCarthy's closed door hearings. And all the hearings that we've seen, the famous hearings, the Army McCarthy and other hearings of Joe McCarthy that were public, were only about 1/3 of his hearings. The other 2/3 were behind closed doors when he thought nobody was watching. So there were no constraints on him. And among the more interesting things that those records showed, aside again from the detail of just what he did in taking to task not just people that he was accusing of being communists, but Jews and gays and you name the group, and Joe McCarthy had some particular gripe against them. But they also showed that in the mornings on these hearings, he was relatively coherent. But after he had his famous 3 or 4 martini lunches, in the afternoon, he became less and less sober and less coherent and less restrained. And so you didn't want to appear before Joe McCarthy behind closed doors in the afternoon. And there were all kinds of interesting and sort of fun, if you can call it fun 50 years later, because we didn't realize then the pain of watching Joe McCarthy's behavior. And one last thing I want to say, that all of these records, 80% of the records made him look even worse than the evil character we thought Joe McCarthy was. And in American history, there are very few people who make it higher on the list of evil characters than Joe McCarthy. But 20% of what I found in these new records made him look better than we ever thought he was. It turns out, despite the skepticism of journalists like me, that Joe McCarthy was in fact the World War II military hero that he said he was. And there were a number of things like that it turned out that he was actually shockingly telling the truth. And the lesson to me was, if you lie enough, and Joe McCarthy lied enough, that when in those rare instances you're telling the truth, nobody is going to believe you. So I want to turn for a minute from Joe McCarthy to the film that presumably everybody has watched, Good Night and Good Luck. And I watched it for, I think it was a 3rd time the last 2 days. And I was struck by 2 things. One is what a great film it was, and the other is how it distorted the true story of Edward R. Murrow and Joe McCarthy. Now, Murrow is, in my mind, one of the great journalistic heroes of all times. And I've actually thought and discussed with my publisher someday writing a biography of Edward R. Murrow. And he is a hero. He's a hero for what he did during World War II in terms of his staying around after all the other American reporters had left Europe, staying around and reporting from rooftops the bombing and all these extraordinary battles in Britain. He was a hero because of what he did with all of the stories that he told on See It Now and on Person to Person and for radio and for television. He was a hero in the end of his life because he came back for one final great set of work experiences running the propaganda agency, the USIA, the U.S. Information Administration for Jack Kennedy. And Jack Kennedy saw a chance to redeem Edward R. Murrow in his later years, and he put him in charge of a very important agency, and Murrow did a great job with it. And I was a Murrow fan. I interviewed and had great sessions with, for my McCarthy book, with Murrow's son, Casey, with Shirley Wershba, who was the woman you remember from the film who was married and hid the fact that she was married, and she was great. So Murrow is great for a lot of reasons, but one of them is not that he brought down Joe McCarthy. Edward R. Murrow himself said, "I was late to the act." And if there were journalism heroes, and there were lots of them, who brought down Joe McCarthy, they were the most famous, the most well-read, the most widely read newspaper columnist in America at the time, a guy named Andrew Drew Pearson, who was syndicated in thousands of newspapers. And he took on McCarthy early on after McCarthy's famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. He wrote 50 to 60 scathing columns. He had McCarthy rake him over the coals from the Senate floor and actually nearly beat him up in the cloakroom when they ran into one another at a fashionable Washington supper club. And Pearson was a hero. Another hero was a famous cartoonist of that era, named, or his pen name was Herblock, Herblock. It was Herbert something Block, and he was a hero. He wrote scathing editorial cartoons on Joe McCarthy, and again, McCarthy went after him. There were lots of journalistic heroes, including, and I'm blanking now on the guy's name, but maybe somebody in the who's listening will remember it, but the guy who did the famous Pogo cartoon strip, he was a hero because he had McCarthy as one of his characters, and he took a real chance. Walt Kelly actually is his name, and he was a hero. There were lots of journalistic heroes. There were reporters at the Washington Post and a few at the New York Times. Sadly, Murrow waited too long, and he told very important stories, and his being as trusted a TV journalist as he was made a difference. But he was, in my mind, a little like Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower gets lots of credit today for bringing down Joe McCarthy. And the fact is, lots of people's lives were ruined in the time that it took Eisenhower to finally develop the political backbone to take on this evil Joe McCarthy. Well, the same thing was true with Edward R. Murrow. And Murrow, in a way, one of the most shameful episodes in Murrow's career has now become the most lionized episode, which is what he did in taking on Joe McCarthy. Murrow also, as the movie acknowledged, let his pal go deeply enough into depression that he killed himself, Don Hollenbeck. And I spent a lot of time with Don Hollenbeck's daughter reviewing what Murrow did or didn't do and what Joe McCarthy did or didn't do. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to stop talking now and see whether people have questions or comments or anything. And I'm glad to talk about Murrow, my hero, Joe McCarthy, my anti-hero, the Mass Historical Society, which if you're not a member of, you ought to sign up because they are brilliant. Anything that you want to talk about.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I want to open this up to the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or put them into the chat, and we will be happy to get to as many of them as we can. I have to say, having recently rewatched the film, I'm struck by how beautiful the film it is. Like, cinematography is just it is a remarkably, like, the contrast, the high contrast in the black and white. It just really is a very beautiful film, and it's very good at setting the scene of that time period. I personally don't have a memory of that time period, but it certainly evokes that history. I also thought, and I'd be interested to hear your thought about this, Larry. I thought it was very interesting the way that they were using actual footage of McCarthy and footage of other people from the time period. So it was like this mixture of, a 21st century film and, mid 20th century newsreels. Did you have a thought about how those were used and if those were used appropriately, or?
So, as somebody who knows nothing about making a film, I can say that I thought that everything that you said was absolutely true. It was beautifully done. It did weave the real Joe McCarthy and the real Edward R. Murrow with the actors. I thought that it brought alive people who are true heroes in the world of TV journalism, not just Edward R. Murrow, but the only person who comes close to him in terms of, in those early days, being a heroic figure was Fred Friendly. A controversial figure who David Halberstam wrote brilliantly about was Bill Paley, who was the singly most powerful person, maybe with Sarnoff being a second, in TV journalism in those early years, and built CBS, but had downsides as well. And we saw some of them there. It was just, I'd never heard of, before I saw the film, the Wershbas, but they were fascinating characters, Joe and Shirley Wershba. And the idea that she was still alive and eloquent and could talk to me about all of that was really fun. It also gave a sense of how rudimentary the workings of TV were. The idea that Fred Friendly was sort of producing the segment by sitting underneath, it looked almost like he was underneath Murrow's chair. I thought all of that was, as far as I know, accurate, knowing nothing about how TV journalism works, but it just gave you a sense of that era in a way that was really fun to watch. And again, the narrative of TV and of film, you don't have to be accurate, you just have to tell a good story, and it was a good story.
I have no idea what film production was like in that era, but I actually grew up in Cambridge, and I used to walk past Julia Child's house on the way to high school every day. So you would see the whole film crews there. And I know that there were literally people hiding under her counter, like holding things up to her. Be like, "Where's my spoon?" And then it would appear. So I think that may have been more accurate than we want to imagine. So we have a question from the audience that says, ask about McCarthy and the 1956 senatorial campaign in Massachusetts. MHS has Henry Cabot Lodge's papers, and there is an undelivered speech written for McCarthy to back Lodge against JFK, but Lodge never asked McCarthy to campaign for him. I don't know, do you know anything about the McCarthy-Lodge connection?
So I do. I think that the McCarthy-Kennedy-Lodge connection is fascinating. And what happened was, as we all know, there was a neophyte congressman from Massachusetts named Jack Kennedy who decided, so Jack Kennedy, as we all know, was the second of the Kennedy children. And Papa Joe Kennedy, who ran everything in the Kennedy family, had wanted his namesake son, Joe Kennedy, to run for every office on the way to being the president of the United States. And tragically, Joe Kennedy died in a flight during World War II, in a bombing flight. And so Jack was dubbed to the most intellectual of that family of 9 kids. He was dubbed to run for Congress initially, and then after very undistinguished tenure in Congress, Papa Joe decided it was time to take on the mighty Lodge family. The Lodges were then to Massachusetts politics a lot like what the Kennedys are today. They looked invincible. And young Jack Kennedy was going to take on venerable Henry Cabot Lodge. And it looked like, especially in a year that was going to be an Eisenhower landslide, it looked like it was going to be a landslide in the Mass Senate race with Lodge winning. And what Joe Kennedy was smart enough to realize was that if his son were going to have any kind of a chance in heavily Catholic Massachusetts, you had to keep Joe McCarthy out of the state, not have him come in and campaign. You know, it's WASP Henry Cabot Lodge, who would have been hugely aided by having Catholic Joe McCarthy come in and even get a modest share of the Catholic vote in Massachusetts to go for Lodge. So Papa Joe Kennedy, who had been giving money for years to McCarthy, called and said, I've got just one favor to ask you, Joe McCarthy, stay the hell out of Massachusetts. And if Lodge, there was always said that if Lodge had really gone and personally begged McCarthy to come, that McCarthy said under those circumstances he would do it. But he said that because he knew that relatively liberal Henry Cabot Lodge was never going to go beg Joe McCarthy to come. He didn't want to owe him anything. He didn't want it suggested that McCarthy was a savior that he needed to keep his seat. And so he was proud. McCarthy stayed out. Jack Kennedy won. I used to know the numbers off the top of my head, but Eisenhower won something like by a 15% margin, let's say, in Massachusetts, and Jack Kennedy won by a tiny, tiny margin. And the margin of victory, I've always thought, was the Joe McCarthy staying out was the size of Joe Kennedy's checks to Joe McCarthy. And the other favor that Joe McCarthy did for the Kennedys of Massachusetts was when Bobby Kennedy, the graduated smack in the middle of his class at the University of Virginia Law School and needed a job, Bobby did what he always did, what all the Kennedys did, is he went and asked Papa Joe for help finding him a job. And Joe again called Joe McCarthy and said, will you give my son a job? And the story, and who knows whether it's apocryphal, is that Joe McCarthy put his hand over the receiver of the phone and said to his staff, remind me again how big Joe Kennedy's checks were. And he ended up bringing him on to be his, to have a relatively important job at his investigative subcommittee called the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And it was Bobby Kennedy, who, as we know, by the time he died in 1968, was the ultimate liberal icon, the most liberal of all the Kennedy kids and most liberal politician maybe in America. But he started out his career working for Joe McCarthy, and not just working for him, believing in him. He used to tell reporters, I don't know what you've got against that Joe McCarthy, but he's the one guy who has the courage to stand up and call out the communists who are hidden in our government. Bobby Kennedy started his life as almost as much of a cold warrior as his father and as Joe McCarthy were. He went to work for him, and he would have stayed working for him a lot longer if Joe McCarthy's top aide hadn't been a guy that he despised, a guy named Roy Cohn. And we all know, I think, the Roy Cohn connection to today, which is that Joe McCarthy's protege, the guy who learned everything about how politics work and how lies are told in America, half a century later became young Donald Trump's tutor. Fred Trump, Donald's father, brought in, as Donald was entering the New York real estate world, Fred Trump decided that Donald needed somebody to tutor him in how to deal in this cutthroat world. And who better to understand cutthroat politics than Joe McCarthy's protege? So I didn't have to, in my book, say much about the obvious connections between the Joe McCarthy playbook and the Donald Trump playbook, because there was a flesh and blood through line named Roy Cohn.
I have to say, rewatching the film, which came out in 2005, so it's been a while since I saw it. It was very shocking how present the clips of McCarthy felt, and these just sort of making not necessarily even directly false or statements that were false, but were on the sort of border of false. Like, you are a member of such and such organization, which has been listed as a treasonous organization, and then the correction is like, yes, they were a member of that organization, but no, that wasn't a listed group. And so it's like, it's these blurry lines, and you're like, is this really? It sounded so much like politics today. It really just sounds very recent.
So it does, and I want to just suggest one more recent thing. I'm not here to do Trump bashing, but the temptation is always there. And I think the one recent piece of news from Donald Trump's world that was in the news yesterday that again has resonance in terms of the McCarthy story is this report that Donald Trump had a Holocaust denier and another recent anti-Semite to his home for dinner. And Joe McCarthy, as I said earlier, is best known for his anti-communist crusade. He's a little bit less known. So there's a Red Scare, there's the Lavender Scare where he went after gays. And one of the things that's not known as well about him is that one of his first crusades, long before there was an anti-communist crusade, was what I think of as an openly anti-Semitic campaign where he wanted to free the Nazi perpetrators of one of the worst tragedies, one of the worst massacres during World War II, which is the famous Malmedy massacre around as part of the Battle of the Bulge. A bunch of American troops who had held up a white flag were mowed down by Nazis. Instead of letting them surrender, they were killed. The perpetrators were caught. There was one senator who said an injustice was done to those perpetrators, and that was Joe McCarthy. And he went after the prosecutors, the Nuremberg prosecutors, for being disproportionately Jewish. And it was blatant stuff. And I think that again, it's reminiscent, not just that he did it, but his defense of doing it. And I think he hired Roy Cohn in part to give him a fig leaf, figuring if I hire as my chief of staff a Jewish lawyer from New York, people will stop saying I'm an anti-Semite.
I wanted to just comment that Rose Doherty wrote in the chat that Walt Kelly had a wonderful McCarthy-style senator, although I don't remember his name. However, there was one time when the pogo strip was deleted from the Providence Journal. Providence loved Senator Joe. And then we also have a question, which was just she said, I'm curious if you have thoughts on why George Clooney chose to focus on Murrow instead of Pearson, et cetera. Because the story about McCarthy is certainly known. So did it really need the weight of Murrow as well?
So I think that's a great question. And I wish I would have to ask, and I never did ask George Clooney why he picked Murrow. But my guess is Murrow was a better known character. TV is more dramatic, and they could play off all the wonderful images that you were describing, Gavin, in terms of what the TV world looked like and being able to show McCarthy on TV. So it was an easier medium to work with. The world knew, if they know any journalist ever, they knew the name Murrow because there are a million awards named after him. People have forgotten Troy Pearson, and maybe because George Clooney and his researchers didn't know the Drew Pearson story and didn't know the real Murrow story, which they should have. But it's a great question, and we should ask them. And if I ever meet George Clooney, I will.
Well, next time I have coffee with him, I'll bring it.
Seriously, that's great.
So Peter just wrote in the chat that there are two Kennedy McCarthy stories that I wonder if you could speak about. That John Kennedy was too ill, in quotations, to vote on the censure of McCarthy by the Senate, and that Robert Kennedy went to McCarthy's funeral but hid from the press.
Yes, so second story first, I opened my book with that image that I tell the story about all these, when Joe McCarthy died, there was an enormous military plane that took all these members of Congress to his funeral. They flew into Green Bay, which was the nearest big airport that could land this military plane. And then everybody went off in limousines to Appleton, Wisconsin, where Joe McCarthy was buried. And it was all Republicans. It was dozens of members of the Senate and the House. And after all of them went off in their limousines, and after the plane was about to shut its doors, or just when the plane was about to shut its doors, one last thin figure came out of that plane, and it was a junior staffer named Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy had promised his brother Jack, because Jack was, from the day he was, his big brother Joe died, Jack knew, or the family knew, that he was going to run for president. And Jack knew it wouldn't be great if little brother Bobby went to the funeral of this leading Republican senator. So he gave Bobby a long speech why he should promise that he wouldn't go to Appleton to that funeral, even though he had worked for and still felt a bond to Joe McCarthy. And Bobby did what little brothers always do when big brothers give them speeches. He politely listened and he ignored the advice. He showed up on that plane, and just at the point that it looked like the airport was going to go dark, Bobby Kennedy came off the plane. He bummed a ride with a reporter who, in his convertible, was driving to Appleton. And he made the reporter promise that he wouldn't say anything about Bobby Kennedy having gotten a ride from him or having been there. He went to the funeral and he went up. Everybody important was sitting down in the main pews. He went up to the balcony and sort of hid out in the balcony watching the funeral. At the graveside service, everybody was over here near the grave, and Bobby Kennedy was way away so that nobody could see him. When all the reporters did the things that reporters generally did back then, which was write the name of every dignitary who showed up at a funeral like that, Bobby begged the reporters who recognized him to leave his name out of the story, saying it would get him in trouble with his big brother. And because he was a Kennedy and because reporters played ball back in those days, nobody put his name in the story. That reporter who gave him a ride from the airport to the church was still alive when I was writing my book. And he felt so guilty for having left Bobby's name out of the stories that he told me all the background to the story. And I could write, half a century later, how Bobby was at the funeral. And I thought that said a lot about who Bobby was. It said he was loyal to Joe McCarthy because McCarthy had been good to him. It said that he was loyal to Jack by going to the funeral, by making it look that he wasn't at the funeral. And it said that this guy, who was the liberal icon, had in fact had the most important tutelage that he had in his early political career from evil Joe McCarthy. And Bobby Kennedy, by the way, always blamed Joe McCarthy's excesses not on McCarthy, but on Roy Cohn, which was convenient, but it was Roy Cohn who was the boss. It was McCarthy who was the boss, and Roy Cohn was his underling. So yes, that happened. Yes, Bobby Kennedy fudged it. And yes, it was a fun story to tell. And I can't remember what the other half of the question was.
Well, the other part was, about John Kennedy being too ill to vote.
Right. So I'm glad when you read the question the first time, you said in quotes too ill. And I would say it was true. He was in quotes too ill. He had back surgery, but that wouldn't have kept him. What senators did back then, and I think they still do it today, is you pair your vote, which means if I'm not going to be able to go to a session, I find somebody from the other party who's going to vote the other way, and we agree that we will both sort of cancel one another out, but we will say how we would have voted. Jack Kennedy never said then or ever how he would have voted, because he knew he would alienate the Eleanor Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party if he said he was going to vote to exonerate Joe McCarthy. And if he was going to vote to censure Joe McCarthy, he'd alienate the Catholic wing and the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party. So he did what any good politician and what any Kennedy would have done. He never said anything. And Eleanor Roosevelt never forgave him for not having the courage of saying how he would have voted. I think he was well enough that he could have voted, but he should at least have told us what he would have done. And when he came out and finally said something, it was a statement that I printed in full in the book because it was such political doublespeak. I had no idea what it meant, and neither did America, and that was what he wanted.
So we had a question about just hearing more about Shirley's experience and what it was, because I believe you spoke with her, what it was like for her being a woman journalist at the time, but also how she was portrayed in the movie and how accurate that was.
So she loved the actress who portrayed her in the movie, and she loved that she became a central figure, and she was a relatively important journalist in an era when she was about the only woman at CBS or any network doing anything really serious like that. And she was, thankfully, to me, she had all of her marbles and was eloquent in explaining to me what was true and what wasn't. She got instinctively, and having been there, she knew that Edward R. Murrow did something courageous, but not half as courageous as he should have, because she knew that Murrow was right when he said he was late to the story and late to the game on taking on Joe McCarthy.
So we also had a question in terms of what it was like to write a book about an anti-hero, considering that many of your other books have been much more likable characters. So do you have any thoughts about writing a book about a person who you didn't like versus Bobby Kennedy, who you also wrote a biography of?
Yes. So I wrote books. I've written books on lots of my heroes, from Satchel Paige and Superman to Bobby Kennedy and some black men who worked on the railroads called Pullman porters. And they were all heroes of mine. It was fascinating. And I've now started doing with various historical groups talks on writing about heroes and anti-heroes. And my challenge when I write about a hero is to make them flesh and blood, finding out things about them that are not heroic. Bobby Kennedy started out with Joe McCarthy. That's a pretty unheroic way to start your political life. And that's something that some of his kids tried to sort of gloss over with me when I talked to them. But Ethel Kennedy, who was my favorite interview for that book, I interviewed 450 people for the Bobby Kennedy book, and Ethel was by far the only essential one and my favorite person. But it's a challenge with anti-heroes, finding something nice to say about them and trying to treat them fairly. And there have been enough hatchet jobs done on Joe McCarthy. I was determined to get a sense of who he was as a flesh and blood character and how he could have gotten fully half of America to think he was a great guy. And I saw his charisma. I would have loved to have gone out for a beer with Joe McCarthy. I would never have wanted to vote for him, but it was fascinating. And I thought he was important enough to American history. I want to say, admit something here, which is that a day before, or maybe it was the week before, the 2016 election, I had signed up to do not a biography on Joe McCarthy, but a biography on Barack Obama. And the day after the election, I realized we wouldn't know Obama's true legacy until the end of the era of Trump. But I also realized that a story that I thought that a pal who was the official historian of the Senate had been trying to get me for years to write about Joe McCarthy. And I thought, that's a story from our distant past. We've learned the lesson. We could never do something like that again. Well, the day after the 2016 election, I realized that the McCarthy story was suddenly timely again, and that to understand Donald Trump, we had to understand his mentor's mentor, Joe McCarthy. And so I was fascinated by it, but I also want to say that my publisher has rewarded me for spending 3 years on Joe McCarthy. I get to do the book that I'm doing now, which is, it's called The Jazzmen, Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Satchmo Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. And if you ever wanted to have a joyful experience, you spend 3 years with guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And I'm much happier now being back with my heroes, with my anti-hero.
I'm glad to hear that. It's very interesting to think about the way that perceptions have changed over time. When McCarthy, at the end of his life, there still had a large number of people who thought of him as a hero. And today, most people, I think, know the term McCarthyism. I think a lot of Americans don't actually know what that's about. But that perception of McCarthy has changed so dramatically. While Murrow has sort of faded into people's memories, like I don't think most people know who Edward R. Murrow was, but they know the name because there's all these awards associated with it. So I don't know if you want to talk at all about that, the sort of changing perceptions. And then I do see that we have a person with their hands up. So after this, we'll get to that.
So quickly, the idea on changing perceptions are that sadly, most people we forget, and we've got very short attention spans. And even somebody as elemental to American history from World War II through the Kennedy administration as Edward R. Murrow, that movie helped us remember him a bit in the popular imagination. And anytime I say the name Edward R. Murrow to anybody, they say, oh, good night and good luck. And sadly, the story isn't entirely accurate, but it gives a feel for who Murrow was. McCarthy was such an evil character and represented something so much bigger than him that we remember McCarthyism, but we blend it into all kinds of other things. I was shocked when I was doing a book tour on McCarthy, how many people think that it was Joe McCarthy that went after all of the Hollywood people, and that was the McCarthy story blends into the story of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which predated McCarthy. It blends into the wider movement of anti-communism, to which Joe McCarthy was an opportunistic late entry. There was a real fear of communists having infiltrated our government, but by the time Joe McCarthy came along, all the 24-karat communists had been rooted out, and he had to go after people who weren't real communists. And it's a scary thing. And if you want to last in our historical perception, you have an ism attached to the end of your name. You're so bad or so good that an entire movement gets named after you.
So I saw that Paul Cronin had raised his hand. So I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I would like to mention a book that defended Joe McCarthy. It's called Blacklisted by History, and he has a whole chapter on the case of Annie Lee Moss, which is covered a major part of the movie. And he basically says she was a communist. He says she was a communist. And he says that even George Clooney sort of admitted that she was, but the issue was that the issue was something about her right to get a hearing. So, I mean, I think there was listing of her in the Communist Party records. And so are you familiar with that book, Blacklisted by History?
Yeah, can you remember Stanton? Well, remind me the name of the authors.
M. Stanton Evans.
M. Stanton Evans. So I had a strange experience, which is that is a very interesting book. I'm now getting, you hearing feedback here?
Yeah. Maybe
Paul,
Paul.
could you mute
Yeah.
for a second? And so the Evans, I had an interesting experience, which was for my Bobby Kennedy book, which was the book before Joe McCarthy. I interviewed Evans because he was an interesting character and had written about McCarthy and about indirectly Bobby Kennedy. And we had a great interview. And the sad thing is he died before I could interview him for about his book and for my McCarthy book. He wrote a very interesting book, most of which I disagreed with. He was an avid McCarthy defender, and I'm skeptical of avid detractors and avid defenders. And so I went to the most credible anti-communist group that I could come up with, the most credible researchers, who were the people who had unmasked the so-called Venona project, which was the decoding of Russian intelligence. The best way we really had to know who were true spies and who weren't was seeing this Venona project, which was our real-time decoding of all the Russian cables showing who their spies were and weren't. And the people who knew more about Venona and who had looked more closely at every name that McCarthy named and every name that the House Un-American Activities Committee, I went to them with names like Annie Lee Moss and with the evidence of Evans and said, help me sort this out. And I'm not going to remember the exact numbers, but they're all in my book. But I went through just about every one of the names with them that Evans had come up with. And the ones that turned out to be real communists were generally exposed by somebody other than Joe McCarthy. And the ones that Joe McCarthy exposed generally turned out not to be real communists. So if we were giving him a baseball scorecard, he would be batting like most of the Boston Red Sox last season, which was pretty miserably in terms of his track record. And I loved, and I wished I could have talked to Evans about this book. I loved his passion. I just didn't love his research.
Well, thank you. So I wonder,
what do you know about the case of Annie Lee Moss?
So honestly, what I would have to do, I wrote the book 6 years ago, and I have to go back and look. And what I remember about it, so I'm not encouraging you to buy my book, but if you want to know what I think about Annie Lee Moss, you'd have to read it because I can't remember the details. But what I remember is that the sense that we got last night that she might have, in fact, her husband or she might have gotten the Daily Worker or various leftist newspapers. That might have been true, but the idea that she was the senior enough to be doing anything damaging or that she was a spy for the Russians was not true, but I'd have to go back and read it in the book. One thing that McCarthy did, and this was the way he obfuscated the truth on these things, was if he proved that somebody was getting the Daily Worker or that they were a leftist, he might have decent evidence, but proving that they were a spy for the Russians was a whole other step. And he never cared about making that last piece of the connection. And that was the kind of thing that the movie suggested. Even when he got some of his facts right, he took them 3 levels further. And that's one of the things that his personal papers showed, was that he'd start with a speech and then he'd gin it up. And he went to Wheeling, West Virginia, when he gave his famous "There are 200 spies in the State Department" speech. And he had 2 speeches in his briefcase. He was looking for an issue. He didn't want to be a one-term backbench senator. One speech was on housing. And had he reached into his briefcase and pulled out that speech rather than the anti-communist speech, we'd never have heard of Joe McCarthy. He would have been a one-term senator. He would never have been linked with the Red Scare, the anti-communist crusade, and we wouldn't have heard of him. But he was an opportunist, and he didn't care what the issue was. He cared that he had an issue and that people paid attention to him. And I think he did a major disservice to serious anti-communists like M. Stanton Evans and all the other people out there, because he basically made them all look a bit like fools, like they didn't have good evidence, so they had to invent things, because that's what he did.
I think that we have time for one last question. Mary Lou wrote, what aspects of Joe McCarthy's youth might have led him to his judgment and confidence in his voice? She also asked, how did he meet Roy Cohen, with a second question, but you could answer either of them.
Say that one more time. What about his voice? What was that?
I think just sort of his ability to speak confidently.
So he had that from the earliest, from when he would get in fights as a kid in his farm in Wisconsin. Everybody knew that this guy was not going to be a farmer and that he could be an orator. He started out in college studying engineering, but it was so clear that his oratorical skills led him to the law and then to politics. He was a brilliant orator. He just wasn't a good truth teller. And so if oratory is all that matters, he set a wonderful model.
Well, we're just at about 7 o'clock, so I want to thank you very much for spending your evening with us, Larry, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I'm sure if people have any other questions, they can email them to programs@masshist.org, and we'll pass them on to Larry or try to answer them ourselves.
Sign up if you're not a member.
Thank you, Larry. So
Bye.
Good night and good luck to everyone.